Angela Wolf-Scott. I am a historic preservation architect and principal at McDonald and Mack Architects, and I've been lucky to work on the Carlson Lime Kiln for the past 3 or so years. So it's really nice to see it actually being preserved and being worked on now. So Carlson's Bluff Lime Works was at its height an industry that occupied a significant portion of the Bluff. There were several structures and a complex of trails that connected the quarry and the buildings and the kiln and the derricks all together. This is the view that you would have approaching the lime kiln now, so that the trail that goes to the kiln is roughly where the spur line for the railroad was, where they went, where they picked up the lime. So today, little of the Carlson Lime Works remains. When we walk over to the site, you'll be able to see the retaining walls that once comprised the sales yard that are kind of in the foreground of this image. And in order to accomplish the preservation work around the kiln, we had to clear cut much of the vegetation that was on the slope. And now you can see more of those retaining walls and more of this industrial site that's next to the kiln. So this is the Carlson Lime Kiln shortly after construction, when it was used for making lime around 1882. And you can see that there were wood structures in front and the sides of the masonry structure, which you can see now, the masonry structure that still remains. And it really looked quite a bit different. And this is how it is now. And with those wood structures gone, there are still some remnants of their foundations and how they attach to the kiln that remains. So we have a lot of clues as to really the shape and size of them that remain with the kiln still now. Since there's very little historical evidence regarding this kiln other than the archaeological remains and the historic photographs that we found during our research of it, all of the openings and holes, shafts and voids that allowed the kiln to function properly when it was in use are currently filled with debris or have collapsed. We also needed to understand how it was built in order to give some recommendations for how to preserve it and stabilize it. And in order to do that, we did a laser scan of the kiln, and everybody who was working on the historic structures report used that data in order to help inform some of their studies. And so that laser scan was taken with a camera that was a little bigger than a shoebox in size. And in only a few hours, it captured enough information from a half a dozen different vantage points to create a point cloud. And the point cloud is a virtual model of the kiln. And through that data, we were able to measure and analyze and look up close at parts that we wouldn't ordinarily be able to do because they were either inaccessible or not safe to access, or just wouldn't be possible. We could measure through the walls, through the kiln, and determine what spaces could be interconnected in a way that we wouldn't be able to do just with the measuring tape on the site. So from that data, we created a simplified model of the kiln that shows how the spaces work together and how the parts of the kiln that we can see were likely interrelated. This process began with limestone, the raw material, which was transported to the top of the kiln and dropped down the drop shafts, which are A and B on the model. Those openings are at the top of the kiln and are now pretty much filled with debris. And in each shaft, the limestone is heated from the opposite sides of, so you can see I and H and G and F kind of at the bottom, in the fuel burning compartments or the fireboxes. And these were accessed from arched openings on the east and west sides of the kiln and from the west and east interior walls of the kiln's large central opening in the middle of the kiln. The heat generated in these compartments caused the limestone to transform into quicklime. And quicklime, the finished product, flowed out of the draw hole at the bottom of the shaft, which is M on both sides, labeled M. And the draw holes were located within two smaller arched openings in the north facade, which are J and K in the model. And the process occurred on a continuous basis. So this was a very efficient way of creating lime. So this section cut through the kiln model shows the relationship in greater detail. As many of you have probably witnessed firsthand, the lime kiln is in a state of deterioration. It has cracks and bulges and missing sections of masonry and collapsed arches, and it is a ruin. Part of our work with the assessment a few years ago was to assess the condition of the kiln and make recommendations for stabilizing the kiln. But these are the standards for historic preservation. If you're really curious, they're online, they're easy to find. And so this falls under the purview of the National Park Service and the Secretary of the Interior. And there are 4 different standards for the treatment of historic properties, and the most applicable for this property was preservation. It was the most economically and logistically feasible treatment for the kiln, and it entails stabilization, repair, and maintenance of the kiln. And these practices will ensure that its structural stability, the safety of visitors, and its place as a key attraction on Barn Bluff will remain and be sustainable. Despite the simple appearance, the kiln is a fairly complicated structure, and I'll give you a really brief outline of the work that we have been doing at the kiln. So the kiln was constructed with mortar in the joints between the sandstone blocks, and that mortar is either missing or was deteriorated and was replaced with a lot of vegetation. So it was like a very large chia pet for a long time. The entire kiln has been repointed, the existing mortar removed and new mortar installed. And since worker safety is critical when working with ruins, cutting out joints overhead was not required for the stabilization. It was really pointing in new mortar where there were voids rather than making the structure less stable than it already is. The area at the back of the wall, at the central arch, where there's the hole, not the square one, but the other one, that has been rebuilt with a pipe to relieve the pressure of the groundwater at the back of the kiln, which is likely the cause of the collapse in the wall in the first place. And there is a large crack that you can kind of see in the top of the central arch. So we're leaving the crack in place. That crack will remain, and we'll leave it open because it is a place where water has been migrating through the kiln for a long time. So we don't want to entirely, it's impossible to waterproof a ruin. So we're leaving some of the existing cracks in place. So there are 2 draw holes. One is intact and one is not. Unfortunately, there isn't a way to stabilize the one that is intact completely. The one that has collapsed, we suspect collapsed because the iron framework inside that held the unburned limestone above the burned lime rusted and broke, and the debris broke free and blew out the brick wall. And since we're unable to get in and stabilize the iron structure inside the other draw hole, inside the other shaft, the best that we can do is to support that wall and support that arch so that when the iron does rust and it does fail, that it won't cause that hole to blow out as well. So the front facade is bulging and bowing, and you can see that the wall is concave at the 2 shafts and convex at the front of the central arch. And Dave McDonald, the structural engineer from Matson McDonald Young, who's worked with us on the assessment and also on the construction project, he was quite concerned about the front wall and its stability, the central part, because with pressure of soil, it was acting roughly like a retaining wall, and since it was bulging, that would presume some instability, that there is some movement that's happening. Originally, he felt that this section of the wall needed to be tied back with anchors into the soil. The other issue was a roughly 10-foot deep hole at the top of the kiln. Not one of the holes that were on purpose, not one of the shaft holes, but an unintentional hole, a sinkhole. And so we being Ray again, recently excavated the top of the kiln. And even though there was a lack of fun items at the top of the kiln, what we discovered were some really great things about the kiln itself. We found that there was only one unintentional hole at the top of the kiln, only one sinkhole, and that hole has been filled in. And we also found that the walls at the rear of the kiln, which were below grade, have indents on top of them. And the top of this wall was originally not below grade, it was originally above grade and had a small trench behind it. And these indents in the top of the wall are beam pockets. And what would have been there originally are beams that would have carried across and connected, supported a bridge-like structure that would have connected the top of the kiln to the trails on the bluff. So the limestone coming down the bluff pulled by a horse and carts would have been brought across the charging platform and dumped into the shafts on top of that platform. So that was a good find. And the rear walls of the kiln are far more substantial than we had hoped or anticipated, which was really good news because it means that they are actually they're acting as the retaining wall and the bearing wall against the soil pressure from the bluff. And so we are far less concerned about the front slightly bulging wall of the lime kiln, and we don't need to do the soil anchors to stabilize that wall. It is stable on its own. So you can see right here, this is the back of the kiln. You can see this little shadow where the bridge-like structure would have been the charging platform. And this is a model of the kiln roughly in the same orientation that shows the beam pockets where the wood structure would have connected into the masonry structure and connected the two pieces together. And after the kiln has been stabilized, it will be more structurally sound than it is now, but it will not be completely safe. We're doing some mitigation to help make it safer, help eliminate some of the risks by filling in the deeper parts of the shafts at the top of the kiln, but it really will not be completely safe. It will still have a cliff at the edge of it. The lime hillside that comes out of the bottom of the kiln is still going to be steep and slippery. And so really a lot of the work for the park improvements and the trail improvements really will go to support the safety of the site so that everybody can enjoy it and be safe around it. So that is the stabilization of the lime kiln kind of in a nutshell. So, thank you.
Who decided that this was worth keeping?
That is a really good question. So part of the Secretary of Interior standards, the preservation with a capital P, the rules, the big slide of words, part of that system is also a system for establishing guidelines and a framework for determining what properties are historically significant and what aren't. And in this case, the lime kiln is a National Register property. So it is nationally recognized as being historically significant. And
there are a lot of those, though.
There are about 8,000 in Minnesota. There are various criteria for which something can be judged and for which a property is determined either eligible or not eligible for being historically significant. And this one was.
We're finishing tuck pointing the top part that we're exposed. We get a little more grading to do on the back side, and then we're working down. We have a wood platform that we needed to set up for our scaffolding. So we got to tear that down and recut the bottom part of this thing and just clean ourselves on the way out. So I'd say about 3 weeks, 4 weeks. Right.
So if you like geology, you'll find this fascinating. Barn Bluff is really perfectly suited to have a lime kiln on it because the bottom is sandstone and the top is limestone. So they could quarry the sandstone from the bottom of the bluff, construct the kiln out of the sandstone, which won't combust, and then quarry the limestone from the top of the kiln and use gravity in their favor to get it down to the kiln. Carlson's property included the quarries that are in blue on the map. So they would have come down the trail with the limestone in chunks in a cart pulled by a horse. They would have gone across the charging platform and dumped it into the top of the shaft. Meanwhile, there would be people in these little side buildings with a big pile of wood stoking a fire inside those arched openings constantly, making it as hot as they could. And inside here, there would be an iron framework that would hold the limestone pieces above the fire. And as limestone burns, it chemically changes and it turns into a powder, into a white powder. And lime is really widely used in construction products, stucco and plaster and mortar. And so as the limestone would burn, the particles, the lime, would fall through and come out the draw holes, and then in here they would be packaged and transported onto the spur line, and then off they would go to be sold. I think it would be similar to this one. There is a tunnel kiln that worked much differently than this kiln, than the kiln that we're here to talk about. This one was a tunnel, so they would have dumped the pieces in at the top and had a fire somewhere along the line, and would have used gravity far more efficiently, actually, to get the lime down the hill. There was also a building that was right here that the archaeologists that were part of the initial study surmised was a storage facility for the lime that was produced in this tunnel kiln. This project is paid for, this one and the report that led up to it were both paid for by the Legacy Grant, which is part of the water tax. I should know this. So it's part of a state of Minnesota grant that part of the proceeds are overseen by the Minnesota Historical Society and are given out to projects such as this that are restoring historic properties. I think that the kiln got to be like 11,000 degrees or something. It was designed to be used continuously. It was the late 1800s. I don't think anybody cared about worker safety or anything. But it's true. I mean, it was designed to run continuously. That was its selling point. So I would imagine they did. Cement frequently competes with lime because they have a lot of similar properties, but they're pretty different as far as both durability and how sustainable they are. So yes, they are, as far as white powdery. They're competitive. Mm-hmm. This was very convenient. Mm-hmm. Until everybody in town decided that they were done with Carlson's convenient operation.
We're Bluff Preservation Tea Club men. We want to shut the quarries down. We're Bluff Preservation Tea Club men. Explosion, such an awful sound. Bluff Preservation, Bluff Preservation, Bluff Preservation Tea Club men.
We know you make your money
By cutting these great bluffs.
We'd like for you to stop it now.
Please don't make us get rough. You know we've really had enough.
If you want to shut our kilns down, pretty movies just won't be found. So maybe cut some more out here, just a little more if you please. Then we'll shut our kilns down for all time. What would we say if you mind on the rock and my love disappeared for all time? Can you imagine this bend in the river without this rock so sublime?
Oh, we get high, we'll help from Barn Bluff. No more chopping up, we say enough. Oh, we get high, we'll help from Barn Bluff. We'll help from Barn Bluff. It's a great segue because I was just going to spend a few minutes talking about our plans for Barn Bluff, and a lot of it has to do with making the trails safe and sustainable and dealing with erosion. And so I think a lot of you know we did a plan for Barn Bluff last year. We had a lot of public engagement. It's an important place to Red Wing. It was, Barn Bluff itself is on the National Register, and along with the kiln, and the bluff is sacred to the Dakota people. We put a lot of time and effort into gathering information and getting people involved in developing the plan. And just real quickly, because I know we're warm here, may want to go look at it too. Our plan has all to do with, in addition to stabilizing the kiln, we're working next on the trails, making them safe and sustainable. And the first project we're starting is this summer. We have the Conservation Crew of Minnesota coming, a work crew of folks that will help us make the North Trail safe. So the Riverside Trail that, we've had accidents and actually deaths on that. And we're improving the tread of the trail. We're putting a cable system in place that people can hold on to the whole length of the North Trail. There's also some locations where there'll be some fall protection on the riverside in key locations, because we found most of those bad spots were in real particular places. And but the project's going to start in mid-July and be done in August or so. The North Trail should be open later in the summer. And then if you saw too, we got a very generous contribution from the Evelyn Sweezy Charitable Fund, over $260,000. The city has budgeted funds, and we're going after when we were talking about legacy funds, the 3/8 sales tax, a big chunk of those monies go towards parks and trails. That's what we've used to renovate Memorial Park, and along with other private giving. And also the new trail from Levy Park to Bay Point Park was funded with legacy funding, and we're going to use the contribution and the city's funding to try to leverage a over $1 million grant from the legacy program. We're going to focus all on the trails, and also I've got a drawing here you can look at later, but sort of the entrance area, making parking more organized, having information kiosks. We've been working with Dakota Community too about interpretation. We want to get a good accessible trail to the kiln and start to work on the interpretation of it. There's a lot of other pieces to that, but we'll be putting that grant in July, and we hope to hear it by September and continue working on it in the next couple of years. Part of what we're working on is kind of wayfinding to help people. It's confusing how to get there. You can see the bluff, but you don't know quite how to get to the east entrance. Our emphasis is on trail improvement, safety, sustainability, and then making the entrance area work better for visitors. And we also want to interpret these great historic elements like the kiln, and let people know more about the Dakota culture that is importantly connected to Barn Bluff, Humichikan.
And the deck that we built, we're rebuilding that center wall there. It's wonderful, half clean, half dirty. Get an idea how much has changed.
This is a panoramic view of what the whole top looks like.
That's
a little bit nicer. So as you can see, you get the two different shaft holes here. And what we had to do is fill the center holes with the limestone chunks to help stabilize that area.
We'll do a project that gets people here and does some interpretation. We had a bigger, more grandiose plan, and that will be a later phase. But I mean, the general concept is to create a array that's not too unlike what they built here.
Like a viewing platform.
Yeah. So you'd have a view of it and then some interpretation around it. Yeah.